Good evening. I'm Jim Ragsdale, and I have the honor of moderating this debate with Mankato's own Talk of the Town radio host, Pete Steiner. We wish to welcome you to tonight's debate, sponsored by Debate Minnesota, with the support of the Otto Bremer Foundation and Blandin Foundation, and hosted by Minnesota State University Mankato and MSU's Student Association. Remember, the primary election has been moved up this year, and it takes place a week from Tuesday.
Debate Minnesota's supporters are from different backgrounds and political persuasions, but they all share concerns about the impact of negative advertising and money in politics and the lack of civility in our political discourse. Debate Minnesota's board includes many of Minnesota's former elected officials, including Senator Dave Durenberger, Governor Al Quie, Senate Majority Leader Roger Moe, Speaker Steve Swigum, Attorney General Skip Humphrey, State Senators Roy Terwilliger and Sheila Cascaden. We're happy to also have in the audience tonight the founder and president of Debate Minnesota, Will Hadelin, and Secretary of State Joan Groh.
Debate Minnesota proposes that we take a lesson from Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas and carry our issues back to the public square, where the real power lies with the people. And as with the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, we believe that the best way to restore civility in the election process is through a series of substantive, content-based discussions between candidates, the people, and their communities. And please join us in welcoming the candidates Matt Entenza, Margaret Anderson Kelliher, and Mark Dayton, and thank them for participating in this debate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And now we ask that you hold any further applause until the conclusion of tonight's debate. We will begin our debates with opening statements from the candidates. Each candidate will have 2 minutes. They have drawn numbers to determine the order. We will then move on to the public policy issues, focusing on 3 important topics: the immediate budget crisis, education's role in economic development, and qualities of leadership for the next governor. Each candidate will have 3 minutes with a 2-minute follow-up. The order will rotate through the night. We will then have time for questions from the audience, which is a more rapid-fire format. After that, each candidate will be given the opportunity to make a closing statement.
Our student volunteer timekeeper is Nathan Gustafson from the Student Senate. You are a student senator, right? Okay. And we wish to thank you for helping us keep on track. That's the hardest job of anyone here. And so I think we're ready to go to our opening statements. And Mark Dayton, you're first.
I want to begin by thanking Debate Minnesota for hosting us tonight, and also Minnesota State Mankato, the alma mater of my outstanding campaign manager, Dana Anderson. I'm running for governor because I believe that Minnesota is headed in the wrong direction. 20 years of 2 Republican governors and a wrestler turned libertarian have done very serious damage to our state. That's what I believe, and that's what I've heard from thousands of Minnesotans as I traveled 87 counties in 87 days throughout Minnesota and held 107 community meetings, where I heard from mayors, including self-prescribed Republicans, who talked about the broken fiscal relationship between them and St. Paul, the cutbacks in local government aids, county aids. School superintendents said the same, how the shift and other cuts in education funding, averaging $1,300 per student in real after-inflation dollars during Governor Palente's 2 terms, have ravaged their budgets. And that's why, just east of here, I visited a 5th grade classroom in Rochester, Minnesota, where I saw one teacher in a classroom with 36 students. And that's why west of here, St. James is one of 10 school districts in Minnesota this fall that can only afford to provide school 4 days a week. Right here at Minnesota State Mankato, 1 out of every 7 professors was laid off last March due to cutbacks in state funding. Now, the Governor Palente says that there have been no tax increases, but we know that's not true. Ask senior citizens. Ask some of the over 200,000 Minnesotans who are out of work in our state if their property taxes have not gone up. The state auditor says they're more than doubled in the last decade. Well, meanwhile, the richest Minnesotans, the 1% of people who make over $1 million a year, pay only 2/3 of a percent of their income in state and local taxes compared to the rest of hardworking Minnesotans. That will change if I'm governor. I'll invest it in education. I'll invest it in a government that's as good as the people of Minnesota deserve.
Thank you. Margaret Anderson Kelliher, opening statement.
Well, first I want to thank Debate Minnesota and Minnesota State Mankato, the alma mater of my mother and my great-grandmother. And it's great to be here hosting this important conversation, this civic conversation tonight. I see so many friends and neighbors in the audience this evening, and that's appropriate. I'm here because of you. I'm here tonight because of the work that you put in every single day. My mom, Elaine, is here. My brothers, who still run the family farm just west of here a little bit. And as a young girl growing up in Mankato, what I know is because of investments in a community, I was able to have the opportunities and the education to be able to rise to where I am today. I learned at a young age, though, that life isn't always easy. Some of you may remember the farm crisis of the 1980s and how interest rates skyrocketed and prices for commodities fell. Well, my family experienced that directly. We almost lost our family farm. And when my family got knocked down, that is exactly when I learned to stand up and fight. And that is what I am going to do for Minnesotans. I'm going to fight for you. I believe that this is the most important fight we can have, fighting for 204,000 Minnesotans who are out of work, including 1,600 people right here in the Mankato area. Fighting to make sure that our kids have a great opportunity at education right here and all across the state. I'm fighting for our parents and our grandparents who are being priced out of their home because of skyrocketing property taxes. Growing up on that farm, I learned something important. You don't stop working until the work is done. And I know where I came from, and I will never forget who I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for you. I will never give up because Minnesota's worth fighting for. I'm here tonight because thousands of DFLers chose me to run against Tom Emmer in November, and I'm excited about that. I'm glad to be with you, and I'm glad to put Minnesotans back to work with you.
Thank you. Matt Entenza, opening statement, please.
It's a pleasure to be here with you. You know, I grew up just down the road in Worthington. And I know what it's like to get knocked down. When I was 15, my father, who very sadly suffered from the disease of alcoholism, walked out of our lives, and we never saw him again. And like a lot of families now, the bank took away the house. And we didn't have health care for years. I'm here today because I had a great community in Worthington that stood around me. I still remember the first time I came here to Mankato to participate in a speech tournament. I was pretty intimidated by the big schools up here. But I really learned that even though I was a kid from a small town, from a single-parent family, that I had a place in Minnesota. And I love this state. It gave me all the opportunities that I ever had. The opportunity to go to college and to be able to afford to go to college. The opportunity to become a white-collar crime prosecutor and put people away who had privileges and took advantage of those privileges. The opportunity to become a leader in the Minnesota legislature. To take on special interests. And to make sure that the needs of average people, including a lot of us who are from small towns around Minnesota, have their needs taken care of. And we need a governor now who's going to make sure that we make our Minnesota education #1 again. Rural Minnesota can't afford to have our kids be our biggest export. We need our products to be our biggest export. We need a governor with a plan. And I have a plan that will help the entire state, but particularly rural Minnesota. Because we should be paying ourselves for energy, building wind turbines across the state, and solar collectors, and the next generations of biomass, and creating jobs here. I want to thank Debate Minnesota because we need more debates like these. Quite frankly, people do not want squabbling between us. And I hope tonight we stay focused on the positive ideas that we have, because that will be the hallmark of who should win this primary and become the next governor of the state of Minnesota. And I hope I can get your support.
Thanks for your opening statements. Our first question has to deal with the state's budget and your proposed solutions. This month's state economic update estimates that when the next governor takes office in January, the state will face a $5.8 billion shortfall. That's just to keep current programs running without accounting for inflationary increases. So I think we want to hear your plans for confronting the immediate problem and the long-term problem, and be as specific as you can about taxes, spending cuts, and shifts. And if you could address the criticism that all of you have received, which is that higher taxes weaken the ability of private businesses to grow and create jobs. And while I'm at it, can you also address the long-term problem? In other words, how do we stop doing this every 2 years and having continuing crises? So, 2 parts: short-term budget solution, including addressing your criticism of your position on taxes; long-term solution to the crisis. Mark Dayton, you're first.
Well, Jim, there are 2 fundamental reasons for these recurring budget crises. First is that since Tim Plenty became governor, there are 200,000 more people living in Minnesota, and there are 14,000 fewer people working in Minnesota. Thousands more are underemployed. So the Republican formula for success in this state, which has been to cut taxes for the rich and make other changes that have those same benefits, has not produced the desired result. Back when I was Commissioner of Economic Development for Minnesota, under the last great jobs governor, Rudy Perpich, and we had a progressive tax system, Minnesota was consistently in the top third of the states in the nation in employment growth, usually in the top 10. During the first 7 of Governor Plenty's 8 years, Minnesota's averaged in the bottom 10 states in employment growth. The economic forecast, an independent economic firm, when it did the last state forecast, pointed out that Minnesota's personal income growth has been below the national average for 5 of the last 6 years. They said that's different from the historic gains that Minnesota has exceeded the nation. The other reason that we have a chronic budget crisis is that, as I said earlier, the richest Minnesotans are not paying their fair share of taxes. Back under Governor Arnie Carlson in his first term, a Republican governor in 1994, the richest 10% of the people in Minnesota paid about the same percentage of their income in state and local taxes as the rest of Minnesotans. Today, the richest 10% of Minnesotans, that's 257,000 households with average incomes of $310,000 a year, pay only 3/4 of what the rest of Minnesotans pay. And the richest 1%, who have annual incomes of over $1 million, pay only 2/3 of the rest of Minnesotans. So the solution to our budget crisis under Governor Plenty in the last biennium, compared to the current biennium, has been to cut state spending by 8.2%, cut education spending by 15%. And yet the result is we're looking, as you said, Jim, at another $5.8 billion in budget shortfall. So my solution is to restore the balance that existed before among the people of Minnesota and ask the richest people in the state to pay their fair share. Just the same percent of their income in state and local taxes as everyone else. Just the same percentage that they paid in 1994 under Republican Governor Arnie Carlson, and that would generate about $4 billion of additional revenues. I've identified about another $875 million by closing tax loopholes, and I've gone through the state budget, line item twice, and trying to find places where you can make cuts without further devastating effects on Minnesotans, and I found about $870 million. I would just say again in response to higher taxes that when Minnesota had a relatively high tax state and we invested in education, we had an economic growth record that was second to none. We had an education system that was second to none, which the economists will say is the key to our future, which President Obama said 2 days ago is the key to America's economic future. Good quality education. We sacrificed that at our peril.
Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
Well, thanks, Pete. I'm going to deliver a jobs budget in this state, a jobs budget that gets Minnesotans back to work and protects our most important priorities. And in doing that, getting 204,000 Minnesotans back to work has to be a top priority. On the campaign, I met Casey McCallum. Casey was a city planner in Jordan, Minnesota, and when the housing cycle went bust, he lost his job. Casey was unemployed for 11 months. He worried every single day how he'd take care of his wife and his young daughter, Pearl. Casey, in his unemployment, at the very same time he was unemployed, I went to work and got to work bringing federal dollars home to our state to invest in clean energy jobs. When we did that in the legislature, Casey got retrained right here at Minnesota State Mankato. He's now employed as an energy auditor, saving other people money, working as an auditor, and taking care of Pearl and his wife. It's important for us to do things that are going to get jobs created in the state, like the TIF for the Marigold dairy property right in North Mankato, something that I helped push through this past legislative session. My first priority will be in creating jobs. I'm going to do it in some specific ways, and our budget is more than a math problem. It has to be reflecting our priorities: jobs, education, and health care. So we're going to use 40% revenue in balancing the state budget, starting with fair and progressive taxation and not making us the highest tax state in the country. That, unfortunately, is the plan that Senator Dayton is proposing. We need a balanced approach to be able to preserve jobs in the state and be able to make sure we're balancing the budget, closing sweetheart deals and corporate loopholes. 30% will come from savings and providing services in some new ways. Things like an Inspector General of Health and Human Services. So the people who are trying to do fraud on the state government don't do it. And 30% will come from temporary tools to get to budget stability. We did not get here overnight. We cannot get out of it overnight. We need a couple of years to do that. My first priority is going to be a jobs budget. My second priority is a jobs budget. And my third priority is a jobs budget, one that's going to get Minnesotans back to work with a balanced approach. And on that claim of taxes and jobs, there is no empirical evidence that shows having a balanced approach, it actually creates more jobs. States move faster out of a recessionary period when they take a balanced approach, raising revenue and making some spending reductions. We will grow faster. It was true for 20-some years. It will be true again when Minnesota gets back on the right track and is able to prioritize jobs and education in the budget, and I will do that as governor.
Matt Entenza.
Minnesota needs to first balance its budget, have a budget that as a part of it leads us back to a path of economic development. So across the state, particularly in rural areas like this that have been hit hard, we can make sure that we're growing jobs, keeping our kids at home if that's where they want to be, and making sure that the entire state of Minnesota participates in a recovery so that Minnesota can be made great again. It's interesting, about a mile from my house, Tom Emmer, the Republican candidate, has a billboard that says that we should vote for him because he says we shouldn't be losing more jobs to South Dakota. Well, you know, Tom Emmer's prescription for Minnesota is cutting the very things that made us great. You know, I used to say that if Mississippi was the national leader because it cut so much, then we would know that's the route that we should follow. And South Dakota's followed that route as well. And yet what Tom Emmer's leadership style is doing is saying that we should follow that route, a route of low-wage jobs, a route where he says that the minimum wage is socialism. I personally thought the minimum wage was something that was about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but you know what? The minimum wage and a strong jobs program, those are values that we've had in Minnesota. And Tom Emmer doesn't reflect those values. We need a balanced budget that follows a balanced approach. And that means about a third through revenue, about a third through cost savings, and about a third through deferments. And I've laid out a comprehensive approach on my website. I believe we do need to raise revenue for those people who make more than $250,000. We voted for big tax cuts when times were good, and everyone got to participate in those. And now when we need to make sure that our schools and health care and other areas need to be protected, it's appropriate that those who have been lucky should have the opportunity to help to contribute to a state that's going to do better. We need to close corporate loopholes. We need to reform the way we deliver health care, and that could be done much more efficiently so we can save money, coordinate services amongst counties, and in doing all of those things, we can balance the budget. But the most important thing is we have to have focus, because we can't be making promises that we're going to spend more money on education or promises that we're going to spend more money on property tax relief, because if we do those things, not only do we have to balance a $6 billion deficit, but a deficit that will get even bigger. I've been very careful to lay out a balanced budget approach and to not promise to spend more money until more money is available. And we can do that by making sure that we enter the new clean energy economy. What that means is we take the $10 billion that we now spend on energy, and we should spend it on ourselves. We should be building wind turbines in Minnesota. They should be owned locally in Minnesota. And the monthly heating and cooling bill that you're paying when you write out your check every month should be going to us in Minnesota, as opposed to now where 95% of that money leaves the state. Under my plan, we can create 50,000 jobs, new billion-dollar industries, and make Minnesota the Silicon Valley of clean energy. That's a strong way forward. A balanced budget, new jobs, and a great economy, and Minnesota can be held great again.
Thank you. We're going to each have a 2-minute rebuttal. I'd like to just reiterate one part of my question, which is your opponent is saying that higher taxes will work against the jobs we want to create. If you could address that in your rebuttal as well. Thanks. Mark Dayton's first.
Well, ask senior citizens in Minnesota, ask middle-income Minnesota families, ask small business owners, ask farmers if their taxes have gone up in Minnesota in the last decade. They'll say, yes, the property taxes have gone up. A much more unfair tax. The issue is not whether there'll be taxes or no taxes, it's which tax on whom. Are we going to make taxes progressive in Minnesota once again and have the richest Minnesotans pay their fair share? Or as we saw under Governor Plenty and we'll see under Tom Emmer, property taxes continue to go up because the state support for education, for our public schools, for local government aids, for county aids is going to decline. Now, let me tell you what the ingredients are, as I learned when I was Commissioner of Economic Development, for job creation in this state by businesses. And it goes, say, to DigiKey, a company that was founded in Thief River Falls in the garage of the owner, now employs 2,000 people. When I went up and visited with the company, they said, what we need is infrastructure improvements. We'll add 900 jobs if we can get a runway that'll land a 757. If we can even get the Commissioner of Transportation or the governor to come up and help us put a stoplight at an intersection where 4,000 people, our workers and then those of Arctic Cat, go to and from work every day. And the reason they're there in Thief River Falls shipping all over the world is because they have a workforce, well-educated, productive, hardworking Minnesotans, educated in our Minnesota public school system that is able to fulfill orders within 24 hours with a 99.85% perfection. Hardworking, well-educated, innovative people is the key to our past success. It's the key to our future success. Good infrastructure, which we've sacrificed under the last 20 years. Good health care, good quality of life, good state and local government services. Those are the reasons that businesses will create jobs in Minnesota in the future. And if we sacrifice those, as we have under Governor Plenty, as we would under Tom Emmer, we will sacrifice the future of Minnesota.
2-minute rebuttal, Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
Well, immediately after taking the oath of office, I will lean down and sign an executive order that will bring $1.4 billion home to the state of Minnesota. Your hard-earned federal tax dollars that get paid every single year. That's going to help stabilize hospitals and clinics, especially Emmanuel St. Joseph's, where I was born. It will be able to bring $6 million. By the end of my first term, it's 30,000 jobs in Minnesota. Means the entire general assistance medical care population is covered and 20,000 more. We're going to invest in our infrastructure, our crumbling roads and bridges to get our economy moving again. It creates 50,000 jobs, almost 50,000 jobs by the end of 4 years, fixing roads and bridges, wastewater, labs and classrooms, just like here at Minnesota State Mankato. We're going to be able to create and invest in small businesses. If we make people employers and increase small business by 7% a year with increased capital and increased technical assistance, we're going to grow our economy by 14,000 jobs a year. And finally, we know that education is the key. A strong economy is based on a great education, like the one I received here in Mankato. We need to reinvest in early childhood, birth to 5, all kids ready for kindergarten, a new education formula that's fair, equitable, and stable, new funding for our schools over 6 years, and finally a recommitment to higher education. It is just not true. The evidence is not there that raising and having a balanced approach in how you balance the budget creates anything other than growth. The Center for Policy and Budget Priorities, a national group, has studied every state economy. When states take a balanced approach of revenue and reductions in spending, they grow, and they grow faster out of a recessionary time. That's what we're going to return to when I'm governor of the state, is that sort of growth and that sort of commitment to education, to health care, and to jobs.
2-minute rebuttal, Matt Entenza.
What we've seen over the last 8 years is a budget that's balanced on the backs of the vulnerable, the elderly, our small towns, a budget that does not reflect Minnesota values or Minnesota priority. The budget of Tim Pawlenty and of Tom Emmer, to the contrary, is a budget that says that we should go backwards. Now, we need to be careful that we don't have tax rates that are in excess of other states, so that we go so far beyond that it could hurt business. But the approach that I'm discussing, the approach that has historically been followed until Tim Pawlenty by Minnesota governors, would make sure that we don't hit those excesses, but instead we hit for home runs. That we get the revenue we need so that Minnesota education can be kept whole, and then as we get the economy going, we can get the investments that we need in education. A budget that makes sure that we take care of our health care needs and that we expand access to health care by getting greater efficiencies. That's the right approach. The approach that Tom Emmer had when he went to the Republican convention was we could just cut 30% out of the budget. Well, you know what? You could cut every bit of higher education. You could close the University of Minnesota. You could close Minnesota State University at Mankato and all the other campuses, and you still wouldn't get to 30%. His approach is a radical approach. I'm proud of the fact that as DFL House leader in 2005, Senator Dean Johnson from Wilmer and I took on Tim Pawlenty and his radical approaches. And we did something that Democrats need to do more of, which is that we stood up. We stood up for what was right. And we said that our rural schools and our schools in the metro area couldn't take any more hits, that we couldn't afford to be eliminating Minnesota Care because driving people to the emergency room as their only source of health care is only more expensive for the rest of us. And we prevailed. And bluntly, we need more leaders with positive ideas who will stand firm and have those sorts of priorities. I was there and I did it. And now we need to make sure that we have a balanced approach and that you have a leader that will help make sure that Minnesota can be great again in the future.
We will be taking questions from the audience a bit later tonight. I did see some of the volunteers moving through. But for now, we move on to public policy question number 2, which regards education's role in economic growth. Minnesota's economic strength owes much to the quality of its workforce. Well-educated and hard-working, yet we're worried about too many children falling behind. Taxpayers want better results. Businesses worry about the quality of their workers, and many of us feel we are already paying enough. This being a time when we don't have new money to spend, how can we get better results out of our education system and out of the money that we are now spending? And how can we more closely link our education system to Minnesota's goals for economic growth? On question number 2, the first response goes to Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
Thanks, Pete. Well, as a mom with kids in Minnesota public schools, I know the pressures that our schools have been under. I know the pressures that our kids are under, and I know the pressures our teachers are under. And that's why I also know that the key to a strong economy, its foundation is built on great public schools in the state of Minnesota. As someone who went to Hoover and Roosevelt and Lincoln and graduated from Mankato West proudly, and in the audience tonight, I know that Jane Shostag, who was my high school English teacher, is here, and Dottie Barrett, who taught me as well. Teachers invested in me. People invested in me, and I know how important that is. My own kids are in public school. I know what we're up against. If any one of the 4 budgets that I had proposed as Speaker of the Minnesota House had passed, we would not be borrowing from schools right now. We would not be in this fiscal mess. And what's happened is that Governor Tim Pawlenty and Tom Emmer said no. They turned their back. So what do we have to do? We have to make sure that we have a great education system by doing a few specific things and doing them well. Investing in birth to 5, our littlest learners, so every child is ready for kindergarten. Being able to make sure that a great teacher, ones trained here at Minnesota State Mankato, are in classrooms in front of our students. Being able to fairly fund our schools, fair, equitable, and stable, whether you're in Medelia or you're in Mankato, that you're getting what you need. And investing in higher education. We know how important this is. Now, I have to say that I think being committed to a new school funding system is important in this state right now. Putting in the long term to do that. Unfortunately, my opponents aren't willing to do that, and one of them actually wants to cut nearly $500 million out of our state budget. I don't think that's right. I have a record of results supporting all-day, everyday kindergarten and increased funding for K-12 education in 2007 and 2008. We need to be able to get this done. A great education is our foundation to a strong economy. I know that as a public school parent. I know it as a graduate of these public schools right here in Mankato. We need to get the job done. And you know, I just think that I agree that that Tom Emmer is not the right direction to move on this front. His commitment to cut 30% of the state budget, I want to be clear about this. That's not 30% of the deficit he's talking about. That's 30% of the entire budget. Will impact early childhood. It will devastate K-12 education in this state, and we will not know the state that we have today. That's why DFLers chose me to run against Tom Emmer in November. They know I will stand up and fight on their behalf. I won't forget where I came from. I came from here.
3 minutes from Matt Entenza.
When you grow up in a little town like Worthington, and you've got a last name like Entenza, which, let's face it, it's not exactly a famous name, and when you come from a family that doesn't have a lot of resources. My poor grandmother was 68 years old when she wound up with 3 teenagers walking in. Now, I thought she was lucky to have 3 teenagers walk into her life. I'm not sure, in retrospect, that I was right about that, but she was so wonderful and took care of us, helped my mom get back on her feet so that my mom could work as a nurse. And I had great teachers. Mary Beth Blagan, who was my sophomore English teacher, who for a period of time I thought was the world's meanest human being. Mary Beth made me stay after school. Mary Beth made me do my homework. Mary Beth would wag her finger at me and tell me I could do better. And of course, over time, I learned that Mary Beth was my best friend. And I'm so proud that after I was elected to the legislature, Mary Beth was not only named Minnesota's Teacher of the Year, but the U.S. Teacher of the Year. That's the kind of teachers that we have in Minnesota. But our teachers have spent a lot of time getting beat up and told that they're bad and told that they're a problem. Well, I'll tell you what the problem is. Our problem are people who don't support public education. People like Tom Emmer and Tim Peleni who've supported vouchers and privatizing. That's not the way forward. The way forward is for us to support teachers and support public education. And that's why I put forward a plan that doesn't promise lots of new money right away, because bluntly, we don't have that new money now. As we grow the economy, we can get it. But we'll close the deficit in a responsible way, and then I have a clear and the most detailed plan on how to make education work. Teachers will tell you, parents like myself who've had my kids go through public school, No Child Left Behind is a disaster. It is a total disaster. It is labeling our schools. Teachers are teaching to tests as opposed to teaching to the highest levels that we need to have. And we need to scrap the system that we have right now because it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. And I disagree with Representative Kelliher. I don't think it's worth sticking with something just because the federal government says they want it in a certain way. I believe we need to follow the lead of other states and adopt a real system of accountability to really make sure that we're looking after the achievement gap. And then I want to follow great practices like those created here at Minnesota State University of Mankato of mentorship that have reduced the number of teachers that we lose, because we lose 50% of our teachers in their first 5 years because they are not getting adequate support and they leave their home districts. The system that developed here of mentorship works. We need to create a clearinghouse of best practices that are available on the web so that teachers can learn practices that work, because we'll have a real type of accountability. We need to get rid of the things that aren't working, focus on the great things that do, and make sure that Minnesota public education is second to none.
3 minutes for Mark Dayton.
My first job out of college, I taught in a public school in the Lower East Side of New York City. I've always said it was the toughest job I ever had. I learned 2 things right away. One is it takes an incredible amount of skill and dedication to become a good teacher. And secondly, no matter how good you are, it's extremely difficult to reach 32 children as I had in one classroom. So that's why when I go around the state and I see overcrowded classrooms in Minnesota, I know that we're going in the wrong direction. When I was in New York, I thought, there's a broken system. But Minnesota is something different. And I agree with Representative Entenza. We have incredibly great teachers throughout Minnesota. That's why when I'm asked who my life's heroes are, I always mention at the top of the list Betty Jo Ogren, my teacher in 3rd and 4th grade, who literally saved my life as I was a new student at a strange school. And that's why I started the Excellence in Education Award Program when I was a United States Senator, something I will resume if I'm governor, to recognize the excellence in education all over the state of Minnesota. Incredibly dedicated teachers, other school personnel, administrators who are doing everything right and seldom get recognized and credit for it under the most difficult of circumstances because, again, under Governor Pawlenty, the average per pupil aid has been cut in real after inflation dollars by $1,300 per student. That's why we're going to 4-day school weeks increasingly around this state. I asked my staff, where else in this country do they have 4-day school weeks? Well, there are a few other states in the rural Louisiana. So great. Now our education system is following the footsteps of rural Louisiana. We're going in the wrong direction. I agree with Speaker Kelliher. It's essential that we increase our birth to kindergarten school readiness. I volunteered in a Head Start program when I was in college. It was known back then what a difference Head Start made, yet in this country, less than half of the children who are eligible for Head Start are able to participate because of the lack of funding. It's even worse than that. It's only about 1/3 here in Minnesota. We're going in the wrong direction. Laying off 1 out of every 7 professors at Minnesota State Mankato to try to make ends meet, making tuition unaffordable for students here. We have the 3rd highest tuition of our 2-year public colleges, top 10 in the 4-year universities. We're going in the wrong direction. And that comes down to resources. And I, more than any other candidate, will raise the revenues necessary to fund education. I'll support a new formula. I'll work with the legislature to devise that. And as importantly, I will raise the revenues necessary to fund what's called for in the so-called New Minnesota Miracle. I'll increase state funding for K-12 education. Every year I'm governor. No excuses, no exceptions. I'll find the money. I know where I can find it. From the richest people in this state, for the sake of our children, for the sake of our future.
All right, we move now to the 2-minute rebuttal portion of the question, which again deals with education's role in economic growth at a time when we seem not to have new money to spend, when we have shifts that have been given to schools that some are worried will become permanent. How can we get better results out of our education system? And 2 minutes for Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
Well, I know the Blue Earth County Fair is going on right now, and I was a 4-H'er in Blue Earth County, and every year I would cook something up and take it to the fair and demonstrate it or show it. And I know we know the recipe for success in this state, and that is a strong education. But we also have to be honest about what's going on. And Matt, we have to be honest that no state in the country has opted out of No Child Left Behind. We need to reform No Child Left Behind. I don't support No Child Left Behind. We need to reform it, working with Tim Walz, working with Senator Klobuchar, getting it changed so it doesn't label kids in schools. So it's based on a growth model that Kathy Breinert, right here, Representative Breinert, has worked so hard to get in the state of Minnesota, because that's how we're really going to get success. We can't afford, in a $6 billion budget deficit, to lose another $500 million. And we would become the first state. Do we think President Obama, with the accountability and emphasis on accountability, is going to allow Minnesota out? I don't think so. We need to reform it. That's what we need to be committed to. You know, I'm proud to have the support of over 70,000 educators along with the DFL endorsement. And we all know that what we need to do is put a great teacher in every classroom. Teachers like Amber Dam, this past year's Teacher of the Year, who's been a teacher to both of my children. It is important for us to have those teachers. And I like the work the Bush Foundation is doing on reform right now, partnering with Minnesota State Mankato on teaching to recruit, to train, to mentor, and to guarantee effectiveness of teachers. That's the important thing here. We are going to have 25,000 teachers retire in the next 10 years. We are missing the forest through the trees. We need to be able to train that new crop of teachers and get them teaching in front of the kids, investing in early childhood, funding our schools fair, equitable, and stable, and investing in higher education.
2-minute rebuttal to Matt Entenza.
Well, you can put lipstick on the pig, but it's still a pig. And NCLB is one heck of a pig, and it's not working in Minnesota. One of the things that our state legislative auditor, who is, by the way, nonpartisan, wrote in a report a couple years ago, is that the cost the cost in Minnesota state dollars of No Child Left Behind was going to exceed any money that we might lose from the federal government. It is not only wasting time in the class, it is not only driving into 5 and 6 useless standardized tests. And let me just tell you how useless NCLB is, the way Minnesota has been running it. We test kids in the spring, and the results don't come back until the summer, when the kids aren't even in the classroom. And then the next year, we test them again in the spring, an entirely different group of kids in the same grade, and the results took it back to the following summer. So that this administration around the state fair can hold a press conference and say that 2 totally different groups of kids have gotten bad results. Representative Kelliher, that is not something that's worth trying to put lipstick on. We need to actually follow the example that your superintendent of Minneapolis used and the state of Tennessee used. And that is to go to the federal government and say, this doesn't work. And they applied for a waiver, and you know what? They got that waiver, the same way we will. I don't believe that we'll lose $1 of funding, but you know what? If the price to get rid of NCLB, which is so bad for our schools, which every teacher agrees is so bad for our schools, I will do that, because that is leadership, and that is leadership that we need. But I don't believe that'll happen, because we can follow what Tennessee has done. We can put into place the type of accountability systems that we have had, and that will work. Leadership means making tough decisions, and you know what? If what we have to do is tell the federal government we're going to do some hard things, then we're going to do it. And we're not going to stick with it just because of Congress. And you know what? I think that when they learn those hard lessons, that's one of the ways we'll get rid of something that's a completely useless mandate. We need to support our kids, support our teachers, and that's what an Entenza administration will do.
2 minutes to Mark Dayton.
I want to go back to the question, which was the role of education in economic development, which President Obama echoed just the other day in a speech where he said education is the future of our national economy. I've been to China 7 times. I've seen some of those 1.3 billion people willing to work and work very hard, 120 hours a week for 60, 70 cents an hour. Jobs used to be here. I visited one Nike plant outside of Shanghai, 5,000 workers. They said 250 pairs of hands touches every pair of Nike shoes. It's not automation, it's not high tech, it's cheap labor. And the young women are sewing the seams, the young men are 100-degree temperature in front of these industrial waffle irons, and they're perforating the soles, and someone else takes it and cooks it, and someone else takes it out. I mean, that's what we call in globalization the race to the bottom in terms of wages. Some of those jobs are going to Cambodia, where they'll work for 30 cents an hour. But what do they have what do they not have in China that we have here? They have a company there called M3, which takes 3M products, Scotch tape, stick them, and imitates it. What they don't have the ability to do is, growing up in a free society and democracy where you can aspire to be whoever you want to be in a capitalist economy, where you have incentives to create jobs, you start a business, you have an idea. Maybe it remains a successful small business. Maybe it grows to become a medium-sized business or a large business. They don't have that ability to take an idea and turn it into an entrepreneurial enterprise and grow a business. They don't have the well-educated, productive workers that they have in DigiKey and elsewhere in Minnesota to be employing those businesses and create new products and new innovation and new ideas that are going to be the key to our future. And that's the key to our young people's success in this global economy. A more challenging economy than we've had in the past, but one where we can and we will succeed as Minnesota because it's plays to our great strength, which is the best quality educational system if we fund it, if we support it, if we support the teachers, the professors, who want to provide that quality education. We give them the resources, get out of the way, let them teach, let them be successful, and our students will succeed.
Thank you. We're going to the third category, which is qualities of leadership. I think a lot of people listen to the specifics, but they're really trying to divine who they think is the best leader. And this question, I'm sorry for the fact that it's a little rambling, but it attempts to get at that difficult subject. We're obviously a very divided nation, maybe not in this particular room, but in the country and the state as a whole. Half the state or close to it will disagree with whatever you do if you become governor. And clearly the partisans will and already have resorted to pretty negative campaigning. We're trying to get at the vision that will sustain you through a trying period, and also how you, as governor, could exert a calming influence over this contentious culture. Can you generate confidence and respect from the public, legislators, and the political parties, so you can bring people together on consensus issues. I know we're not going to agree about everything, obviously. In other words, when you speak as governor, why should people listen, particularly those who voted for the other side? And sorry, Matt, but I think you're first on this.
My family came to Minnesota over 150 years ago. My great-great-grandfather, John, came from Norway because, as they say, you can't farm rocks and you can't eat a good view. The Norwegians did not come here because they were looking for investment property. They came because they were starving. And he fought in the Civil War. He helped beat the South because he fought for the cause of freedom and against slavery. And they homesteaded 80 acres of land with all the other Civil War veterans and their new families in far western Minnesota in Lac-La-Parle County. And the first year they got the crop in, and they thought they were finally working their way up, and then the locusts came in from South Dakota, and they ate pretty much everything up. And my great-grandmother Minnie, who lived to 99, and she was Minnie, she was about 4'10", but she was my great-grandmother and a lovely lady. She told the family stories, and she said, they got together, and there were some folks who said, you know what, we're just going to make it on our own. And if other people don't make it, then I guess we'll get something cheap. We might get their land on the cheap. We might get their cow on the cheap or a wagon. And she said, my great-great-grandfather and the other veterans got together and said, we made it through this war because we stuck together. We're a community. And we're not going to let people fall behind. We won because we are a team. We are together. And the next year, when they had a crop and they had some opportunities, they didn't spend the money on fancy clothes or new houses. They were living in sod huts. They went down the Minnesota River Valley to Montevideo to get lumber, because there's not a lot of trees in Lac-La-Parle County. And they did two things. They built a little church because they wanted a place where they could come together as a community and recognize and worship something bigger than themselves. And the other thing that they did is they built a little school, because they knew the most important thing they could do was to sacrifice to make sure that their kids and the next generation could do better than them. And you know what? That's the kind of leadership that we need. That's why I'm so proud this week that I announced a leadership team of people who come as Minnesotans. One of the things that Jesse Ventura did, besides a whole lot of wrestling and boas, is he actually built the best cabinet that Minnesota's ever had. And I'm proud that people like Elwyn Tinklenberg, who took on Michelle Bachmann in the last election, but who was Commissioner of Transportation and helped get light rail going in the Twin Cities and improved roads all across rural Minnesota, he's endorsed me. Dave Jennings from Truman, Minnesota, former Republican Speaker of the House, but a great ardent supporter of public education who's become an independent, he's supporting me. Not to mention them, but other Ventura commissioners and Democrats and other Republicans who recognize that we need someone, a governor who comes from Worthington, who hasn't forgotten where he comes from, who knows that our best days are in front of us when we come together to refocus on education and job growth, that we don't make promises we can't keep, but instead we're focused on making sure, will the next generation do better? And that's why I want to be your governor.
3 minutes on the leadership question to Mark Dayton.
The qualities of leadership that I think are important are, first of all, the ability to listen. When I worked for Governor Perpich, he had a sign in his governor's office that I'll put back if I'm governor: none of us are as smart as all of us. And Governor Perpich was a sponge for other people's good ideas that he then put forward to benefit Minnesota. That's why earlier this year I traveled to all 87 of Minnesota's counties, having been there many times before, to listen once again to the people of the state where the best ideas come from people that live their lives. I remember a farmer up in Warren, Minnesota, talking about the disconnect with the state agency leaders in St. Paul, DNR, and some of the other political appointees that Governor Plenty's made. He said, if we could just combine the supposed expertise in St. Paul with the walk the land wisdom of the people like me here in Warren, Minnesota, we get a lot more done. That's the kind of wisdom and insight that a leader gets from listening to other people. Another is service, a commitment to service. I greatly respect and admire the commitment to public service that Speaker Kelliher and Representative Entenza have demonstrated throughout their lives. I believe I've done the same. I've worked on most of the last 35 years on behalf of Minnesota, served as Commissioner of Economic Development, of Energy and Economic Development, State Auditor, United States Senator. I've been all over the state working on behalf of people, try to create jobs, alternative energy, better future for Minnesota. And then the third quality I think is important is the willingness to lead during hard times. And these are difficult times for Minnesota. There are no easy answers. There are better and worse answers, there are right and wrong answers, but there are no simple answers to the challenges that we face. And sometimes you have to take a stand. I'm proud of being the only Minnesotan on Richard Nixon's enemies list, a young man for standing up to an unjust war. And I still said it, you can put that on my tombstone. I'm proud of being one of 23 senators to stand with the great United States Senator Paul Wellstone in opposition to the Vietnam War at a time when public opinion polls said that 85% of the people in this country supported that work as they wanted to believe their president thought they should have been able to take a stand, contrary to public opinion, because I believed it was right. And yet, I agree with you that you also need to be able to bring people together. And that's why I'm proud also in my last year in the Senate of working with Republican senators to get the first congressional funding for the pioneering program of the Minnesota National Guard Beyond the Yellow Ribbon to support our returning Iraq and Afghan war veterans and give them help beyond that first day of celebration to readjust to their society, to reintegrate with their families, find their jobs or find new jobs, give them the support that they need. Finding common ground, bringing people together in a bipartisan way is also that important part of leadership. And I hope to be able to provide that to the people of Minnesota.
3 minutes on leadership to Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
Well, first of all, I've been in the arena. It's been a tough time in the last 4 years. I've gotten knocked down from time to time. But you know what I keep doing? I keep standing up and fighting on behalf of Minnesotans. And fighting for their values and bringing people together are not incompatible. In fact, all you have to do is look no further than the example of the 35W bridge collapse and what happened when we needed to make an investment in our crumbling roads and bridges across this state. I built a coalition. It was a coalition of Democrats and Republicans, a coalition of business and labor leaders, a coalition of environmentalists and farmers who came together and stuck together to override for the second time in state's history on a matter of revenue in 150 years a governor because it was the right thing to do. I've been called the calm within the storm. I've been respected by Democrats and Republicans. It's why I have the support of the DFL party as the endorsed candidate, winning the support of thousands of Minnesotans. It's why I have the support of many of my former Republican colleagues who've left the legislature because they've been drummed out. It's important right now for a governor to know that when we're talking about important projects, things like the 169 and Highway 14 intersection, that governor is going to listen to people to get it right for the businesses in the area. That the governor is going to bring people together so we don't have waste like happened on the nursing home at the St. Peter Regional Treatment Center because things were built wrong. We need a governor who knows you work until the work is done. And that's what I learned on that family farm a long time ago. Those are my values. They're important values. I think Minnesotans don't wake up and think about if I'm a Democrat or a Republican or Independence Party member. No, they wake up in the morning and they think about how am I going to help my family get further ahead? How are we going to do better? How are we going to make it? And as a middle-class mom, I understand that. I understand what it's like to pack your kids' lunches, send them off to school, make sure the checkbook balances at the end of the month, and how hard that can be. I'll work with everyone who has a good idea in Minnesota to pursue jobs, education, and you know what? I have proven that I will do that time and time again. That's the sort of leader I've been. You know, you can hear my colleagues talk about it. There's no more shouting in our caucus. There's just no more bullying in our caucus. There's just no more yelling. We talk it out. And that's what Minnesotans want. They want us to come together. You know, I came from here, I learned my values here, and those values are bringing people together. That's what kind of governor Minnesotans want. They want a governor who won't give up.
Thank you. In your 2-minute rebuttals, could we look at maybe a little bit of, is there any middle ground on some of these intractable issues, or do we just have to agree to disagree? Matt Entenza for 2 minutes.
You know, when I was talking about my great-grandmother Minnie, one of the other things that she told me, it was difficult when they were first out on the farm, and their squabbles would arise, and there'd be issues about who would help others. She said my great-grandfather was good about wanting to share, but under his breath he'd say, as a Norwegian Lutheran, he'd say, I know this is what I'm supposed to do, but it's really hard to share with the Swedes. And it seems hard to believe now that Norwegians couldn't like Swedes. And out there were Icelanders and Poles and Germans and Finns. And yet the differences that they brought back from the old world made it tough at times. The Iron Range is a place that I've spent a lot of time campaigning, and there Croats and Slovaks and Slovenes and others had to figure out that wars that they had fought for generations would end on the Iron Range and that they could instead build a new place. And so I think that Democrats and Republicans and independents need a leader who's going to help bring people together, which is why you won't hear me talk about fighting, because I don't believe we should be fighting for things. I believe that we need to be bringing people together. But we need to understand that there's some common things. Is the next generation going to do better than us? Are we going to make sure that education becomes first and foremost again? Because there's always going to be some folks that say, I want things for me. But at the end of the day, leadership is saying it's not about me, it is about we. It is about us. It is about community. And that's why my plan to balance the budget is one that is balanced and that doesn't try and hurt rural areas the way they've been hurt with budget balancing now, but says that everyone will sacrifice and everyone will get rewards. And we're going to refocus on education, we're going to get the economy going, and we're going to bring this state back together again.
Mark Dayton, leadership related to attacking tough issues together.
Well, Jim, I think it's important to understand how far Minnesota has veered from the middle ground in the past decade. I mean, as I said earlier, this biennium compared to the previous biennium, Governor Plenty and the legislature cut state spending by 8.2%, by 15% for K-12 education. We rank 32nd among the states in the nation in spending on K-12 education as a percent of our personal income, 34th higher education. We've fallen precipitously in real dollars and relative to other states under Governor Plenty's assistance of protecting the richest Minnesotans from paying their fair share of taxes. Now, can I find middle ground with the CEOs of Target Corporation and Best Buy who are putting hundreds of thousands of dollars behind the Republican candidate for governor because they don't want to pay higher taxes? People are making millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. I remember my family meets once a year and we look at our financial situation. My Uncle Ken, who's passed away, was one of those, along with my father, built Dayton Hudson with the help of thousands of Minnesotans. And our family income had combined had increased for the previous year. And one of my conservative Republican cousins was complaining because our tax increase is also increased. And my Uncle Ken looked at me and I said, we should want to pay higher taxes because that means we're doing better. And if we're doing better financially, then we have an obligation. We have a responsibility to pay higher taxes. If we can find that common ground of ethic with people in Minnesota who are better off than anyone else in this state, who are better off than almost anyone else in this world, and all I'm asking them to do is pay their fair share of taxes, that's middle ground. But I'm not going to sacrifice school children in this state. I'm not going to sacrifice 5-day school weeks. I'm not going to sacrifice quality education here at Minnesota State Mankato for the people who won't find common ground of what's fair and reasonable for the people of this state.
Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
I was proud this week to earn the endorsement of a major newspaper chain in the state, ECM Publishing, former Governor Elmer Anderson's publishing company. And in that editorial endorsement, a very strong endorsement, you could go to our website and see it, margaretforgovernor.com. What they said is, my choice of John Gunyu as a lieutenant governor candidate was one of the strongest made in recent memory. Because John's an expert. He's an expert in state budgeting. He's an expert in local government finance. He's going to be a good partner as the lieutenant governor. But it also talked about me, and it talked about near visionary leadership and the need for a next generation of DFL leaders. That's exactly why the DFL party endorsed me back in April, to run against Tom Emmer, to take on these ideas. And like I said, Minnesotans don't find it incompatible that you're going to stand up. Their governor is going to stand up for them and fight for what they need. Fair and progressive taxes, better health care, education for all of our kids, and still be able to bring people together. That's been my track record. That is my history. I'm so happy to do that work of bringing people together. I've been doing it ever since I was 4-H president, state 4-H president in the 1980s. You know, there's not a lot of Democrats in 4-H, if you'd noticed. And they elected me. About 1,000 kids elected me to be their president. It's because I understand the entire state. I bring people together. I bring them together about our common values. And that's what we need a governor to do. We need a governor who understands you can't stop, you can't quit, you can't back down. We are in the race of our life against other states, against other countries. Our kids are in the race of their life. We need a governor who knows how to stand up and fight, but yet bring people together. That's exactly what I've done time and time again.
Thank you very much. We move now to the portion of the program which is questions asked by you, the audience. Thank you. We have a hassle of questions that have been asked, and unfortunately we're probably
A plethora.
only get to about 4 of those questions. Jim has said that I could pick the first one. I do this, let me explain, as I speak to a lot of local leaders here in the area, from leaders of Mankato and North Mankato to some of the smaller cities like Eagle Lake and Mapleton. This is a question that seems to resonate with them, but I think probably Jim would indicate that Minneapolis and St. Paul probably have this same issue. And I'm going to read it just as the audience member phrased it. It regards local government aid, better known as LGA. And the question would be, and I believe, Mark, you go first. Will you restore LGA? LGA cuts are killing rural Minnesota. 2 minutes to Mark Dayton.
Well, I couldn't agree with the questioner more, and that's what I've heard from local officials all over this state. And again, with the cuts, drastic cuts in the last decade, that's why property taxes have had to go up, and yet essential services, police have been laid off, firefighters have been laid off. Yes, I would restore those cuts. I will, again, raise the revenues. The only one who's going to raise revenues sufficient to avoid these kind of continuing cuts. And of course, the Republican candidate, Tom Emmer, wants to eliminate local government aids. You know, I was up in Wadena a couple of weeks ago and helped with the cleanup after the devastating tornado there, and the mayor took me around and he said, you know, we're a poor community. 1/3 of the people in this city have a net worth of less than $15,000, and yet their homes have been destroyed. And yet even in the midst of that, fortunately, amazingly, no one was killed. No one was even seriously injured. He said, I'd like to bring Tom Emmer and his running mate, Nat Meeks, who want to eliminate local government aids up here and tell them what local government aids has enabled us to do here to save lives. An early warning system, emergency response would not have been possible in a poor community without local government aids. So in greater Minnesota, and again, I've heard it from Republican mayors who came to these community meetings and said, you know, we're not here to support you, but we want you to know how badly the fiscal relationship and the trust relationship has been broken between us and St. Paul. We can't be effective if we can't rely on the word of policymakers in St. Paul who promise us a certain amount of support. We factor that into our budgets, and then some of it is taken away. I mean, the words like a shift, euphemisms like that. You know, if somebody reaches their hand in your wallet and takes out away and says, I'll give it back to you when I feel like it, we don't call that a shift. That's what's happened to school superintendents, to county commissioners, to local government officials. I will put an end to that because I'll raise the revenues to support those essential support payments.
2 minutes for Margaret Anderson Kelliher on local government aid.
Growing up in rural Minnesota, I know how important this issue is. This is about property taxes. This is about basic services. And as someone who owns a piece of property in LeSueur County in Cleveland, I know how important it is when a tornado hits that there is help nearby. I was out there in the bean field, so was David Kelliher, picking up the debris after that tornado in Cleveland. After the tornado in St. Peter, we know how important this is. So that's why over the last number of years, the DFL legislature has been trying to increase local government aid, funding the formula that is there on the books. And in my budget, I am planning to fund at the level that it should be funded at in the 2012 budget. And that means restoring those cuts, being able to do that, planning forward for that, because that is jobs. Those are good jobs. And you know, that's a big difference here, is funding those jobs and being able to make sure the police officers on duty, the sheriff's deputies on duty, that people are there to help people at a time of need. We need to rebuild this relationship, the state-local relationship. It's one of the reasons I chose John Gunyu to be my running mate. As a city administrator in Minnetonka, he has relationships all across the state with other city and county leaders, as I do. And we are going to work together to stabilize the way we're going to fund our current formula. It was an important reform a few years ago when we did this. We need to keep our commitment to reform. We need to make sure that places like Mankato as regional centers are able to protect and serve people. And I know we can do that. A strong commitment to those basic services, police, fire, libraries, being able to make sure people have what they need. That's my commitment to you, to be able to deliver on a strong state-local relationship.
2 minutes on local government aid to Matt Entenza.
Under Tim Pawlenty, and with Tom Emmer's help in the legislature, we've seen the budget balanced on the backs of our poorest cities. And that's hit rural regional centers hard, like my hometown of Worthington, like Mankato here. But it's also hit a lot of other communities hard in the Twin Cities, like South St. Paul or Columbia Heights. We used to have a bipartisan agreement in this state that we wanted to make sure that those communities that weren't particularly wealthy, that might not have million-dollar homes and a high property tax base, would at least be able to have the core services, police and fire and snow plowing, the things that would make sure that they could keep people there and grow as communities. And what Tim Pawlenty has done under the so-called no new taxes ideology is instead force up property taxes around the state, label things that we used to call taxes as fees, which by the way have gone up 65% with the support of Tom Emmer and Tim Pawlenty, and our communities have suffered. And that's why we need a governor who I might add is from so far deep in southern Minnesota, I would be the governor from the farthest south in the history of this state. And I think sometimes when you're way out on the frontier and the edges of the state, it helps focus you about the fact that you are part of a community and you need help. That's why in 2005, when after Tim Pawlenty had cut 50% of local government aid and devastated rural communities, Dean Johnson and I stood up to him. And he forced a government shutdown. And at the end of the day, we prevailed. The only time that Tim Pawlenty was forced to sign a bill to raise revenue, and we helped our schools, we saved Minnesota Care, and we helped local government aid. And that tells you where my priorities are. But we have to also be very careful about what we're going to promise, because every time we promise to spend more, we have to show where we're going to raise the revenue. And I've laid out a budget that balances, a way to grow jobs and increase revenue, and local government aid will be one of the places I want to make sure we put that new revenue.
Second question from the audience. I'm going to overlook the question that asked if Brett Favre is in the building and could we check behind the curtains, but I don't think he's here. Maybe I should ask you what your policy is on getting Brett Favre back to Minnesota. Good question from Dina Mankato. If you believe the solution to a problem is against the general ideals of the Democratic Party, do you decide based on your judgment of the situation, or do you rely more on party opinion? It gets at some of these pressures you would feel as governor. And Margaret Anderson Kelliher's first 2 minutes.
Well, I'm proud to have the endorsement of the DFL. And one of the reasons that I was endorsed is because people know I use common sense. And they know I bring people together to solve problems. And that's what Minnesotans want. They want a problem solver in the governor's office. You know, we've had too much of go it alone, go it your own way, put your presidential ambitions first. And what we need is we need someone who's focused on Minnesotans. And when you're focused on what Minnesotans need, you're going to put the interests of Minnesotans first. And that means that you're going to look for ideas from all sorts of places, not with a party label on them, but with common sense, to be able to come together. You're not going to cut your nose off to spite your face with some sort of pledge to do something that no one else has done in the country or been even tried to do in the country, like opt out of something that President Obama is saying we need more of, accountability in schools. We're going to be able to come together and do it a Minnesota way. Find the growth model for testing and assessment for kids in education. So when your child in 6th grade maybe slips a little bit in math, there's an intervention there that they can get up to the level of 7th grade. So being able to make sure that when we're working on teacher training that we take good ideas from places like the Bush Foundation and we make sure that we're funding quality teacher training programs across the state. We're going to take ideas from other places where they've been successful and incorporate them in Minnesota. I know how to do that. I know how to bring people together to get that done. And so I think putting Minnesotans first is going to be the most important priority in the interest of getting Minnesota ahead in job creation, in success in education, and being able to move forward. And that's why I brought in a summit a couple years ago on early childhood education and learned from Florida what they've done. Florida's ahead of us on early ed. We can catch up, though, if we have a commitment to do it.
Madam Entenza, Dina's issue is political pressures lean one way. The situation might dictate something else. You're all going to face it. How do you deal with it?
Well, as Democrats, and I suspect most of us in this room are Democrats, we have to take a hard look at ourselves. It has been 20 years since a Democrat was last elected governor. It has been 40 years since someone with the DFL endorsement was elected governor in an open seat. That is older than a lot of you in this room by a long shot. And one of the reasons why Republicans have won is recently they have promised things. They have promised tax cuts. They have promised that there is an easy way that doesn't require sacrifice. The roads will be fine, the schools will be fine, and you can still get big tax cuts. And that's how we got the Bush deficit after the Clinton years when we were running surpluses. And now we run deficit after deficit after deficit. But Democrats need to look at themselves in the mirror as well. Democrats have been too prone to promise things, to turn to all the groups that show up and say, you can have more money for education. You can have more money for health care. You can have more money for human services. You can have more money for transportation. And I think one of the reasons why I have been supported by such a wide range of folks, people like Sue Perpich, the daughter of former Governor Perpich, people like Dave Jennings, former Republican speaker and now independent, who believes in public schools and just retired as superintendent of Chaska, and a whole range of great leaders around the state like that, is because I haven't been willing to make those promises, because we have to have focus. That's why I've said we'll make education a focus. I'm not afraid to take on the federal government, which is why we are going to take on No Child Left Behind, because we can't be afraid. We have to do what's best for us. When No Child Left Behind has been a failure, I just disagree with Margaret on that. That doesn't mean you stick with the feds. It means you tell the feds they're wrong. And that's why, as leader, we're going to make sure that it's about Minnesota solutions and making sure that we do come together to refocus and reprioritize our state.
Mark Dayton.
I've told the DFL party leaders that much as I like and respect them as individuals, I disagree with their process and their insistence that they should dictate to all the people of Minnesota, all the DFL primary voters, who the only candidate the voters should have to choose from should be. I told them that runs contrary to my ideals, runs contrary to my principles and my beliefs in a democracy. The people will decide, as they should, as will happen on August 10th when we have a primary. When people who can't make it to their caucuses, can't make it to the convention because they're working, because the senior in my apartment building in Minneapolis was afraid of the ice on the sidewalk that night, can go and, as Americans, register their vote for the person among us who they choose. I'll stand on my principles, whether they're popular or not. As I said earlier, I was one of 23 U.S. senators who stood up against President Bush and the misinformation that he was and his administration were providing the American people to justify a war, claiming there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, nuclear weapons, terrifying citizens in the aftermath of the terror of 9/11. It turned out to be untrue. And I'm proud of standing with Paul David Wellstone, a great United States Senator from Minnesota, and 21 other U.S. senators in the face of public opinion, doing what we believed was right. And I know the next governor is going to have to make unpopular decisions. And I'm prepared to do that, as I have all my life, to stand up for what I believe in, to stand strong on behalf of what I believe is right, to listen to other people first, but then to take a stand and to tell whoever they may be, well, I think what I'm doing is in the best interest of the people of Minnesota. If I'm elected governor, it's by the people of Minnesota.
Trying to be very efficient, I'm going to combine two questions from the audience here into a general question about leadership for a 2-minute response. This part one comes from Don Ostrom, who is here tonight, and I don't think he'd mind if we acknowledged him. A lot of us know Don. And the other question is one that I had also talked with another audience member about tonight, being that we assume that most of you are DFLers. So the question then, combining two questions, the other from Steve Gilbert. How will your most recent job help you be a better governor, and why are you the best candidate to go up against Tom Emmer? And I believe Matt Entenza gets the first 2-minute shot at that.
Well, Pete, of course, you know very well my most recent job. I was the founder of Minnesota 2020, which is a nonpartisan progressive think tank affiliated with Macalester College. And Minnesota 2020 was founded because I believed that we needed a place that would have a clear mission. A mission that said that when Minnesota focuses on economic development, on education, on transportation and health care, that we all do better. And one of the things that we did at Minnesota 2020 when we started is we looked for some of the best minds in this state to come together and take a look at what are the policies that could bring people together and make sure that Minnesota did well in the future. And I assumed initially we'd have a lot of academics, and we've certainly had a lot of academics that work with Minnesota 2020, but we actually discovered Minnesota's biggest renewable resource is journalists that have been laid off. And that's an unfortunate thing, but it's true from all of our newspapers and radio stations and what have you. And a lot of great journalists from some of our best newspapers and others came. And the first report that we put together was about the mentorship program created here at Mankato State, or at Minnesota State University at Mankato. And Minnesota 2020 is widely quoted by my DFL friends who are here on the stage with me, and it's had a big impact on policy. And I think that having stepped away from partisan politics, where I helped take the DFL out of the minority, deep in the minority, and helped to bring them back, and I understand how the Capitol works, but I've had the last few years to focus on where the state should go. And I think that's the place where we need to be. It also gave me the chance to meet Robin Robinson. And of course, Robin Robinson, for 15 years, anchor for Channel 9 in the Twin Cities, is my running mate. Someone who's a former fellow of public policy at the Humphrey Institute, someone who I discovered was extraordinarily bright and charismatic, and someone who will join me to communicate our vision. And the Entenza Robinson ticket is one that does want to make sure that Minnesota's best days are ahead.
I'll repeat the question for Mark Dayton. How will your most recent job help you be a better governor, and why would you be the best candidate to go up against Tom Emmer? 2 minutes to Mark Dayton.
Well, my 6 years in the United States Senate in Washington reminded me of what an amazingly wonderful place Minnesota is by contrast. I said before I went to Washington that I thought it was a cesspool. I said after I got there I realized I underestimated just how bad it really is. And I learned that the executive branch, which is where I had the opportunity to serve in Minnesota for 3 different times as Commissioner of Economic Development, Energy and Economic Development, and State Auditor, is a place where you can lead from day one, which is why then I saw President Obama leave the Senate to seek the executive branch, Secretary of State Clinton, and even Vice President Biden left the Senate after 36 years of seniority, because the executive branch is where you can lead from day one, where you can make things happen on behalf of Minnesota. And working for the last great jobs governor of the state, the last great governor of the state, Rudy Perpich, I saw again how a governor can set the agenda, provide the leadership, and the kind of leadership that is just antithetical to where Tom Emmer wants to take the state. Now, any of the three of us would be a vastly better governor for Minnesota than Tom Emmer. Any one of the three of us would provide the kind of leadership that Minnesotans are looking for. And that is, why we have elections, for the people to decide. We can say whatever we want. You, the people of Minnesota, are those who make the verdict, cast the verdict, as it should be in a democracy. As you will on August 10th in the DFL primary, is in the general election. From what I've heard from all of you in Minnesota, you want a different direction for this state. You don't want to take where Tim Pawlenty has taken us so far before he abandoned us for his presidential aspirations and see it carried to a further right-wing extreme by Tom Emmer. You want a better direction for Minnesota, a better future. You deserve a better future, and the DFL leadership will provide that better future, and I respectfully submit to you on August 10th, I ask for your consideration having the opportunity to lead the state into that better direction.
Margaret Anderson Kelliher, how will your most recent job help you be a better governor, and why are you the best candidate to go up against Tom Emmer?
Well, in 2006, when we won the DFL majority in the Minnesota House, I was elected by my peers as the Speaker of the House. Not quite the youngest speaker, and not the first woman speaker, but to be able to lead at a young age, to be able to come forward with the next generation of leadership, to commit to the values that Minnesotans want to see. I've had a lot of experience in bringing people together. These have been tough years, the last 4 years. Being in this arena, being in the fight, having to stand up to Tim Pawlenty, having to create an override over this governor, has taught me a lot about what we need to do. We need to work with employers in the state to create more jobs. We need to work with Republicans in the state to be able to overcome some of our biggest differences, to move public policy ahead. I can do that. I've done that time and time again, whether it was the transportation bill, whether it was the legacy amendment for clean water, hunting and fishing, arts, culture, and history. I did that. I put that together. I put that coalition together. The renewable energy standard that we passed in 2007, nation leading, creating the investments that are happening today, making jobs happen in the state of Minnesota. But why would I be the best governor? I'm optimistic. I believe in Minnesota. I believe in Minnesotans. I care about people. I am pragmatic. I will get things done. And you know what? I'm tough as nails. I grew up with 4 older brothers on that farm and an older sister. There is nothing that they haven't thrown at me that someone can throw at me today, believe me. And being able to be that person who understands that and can work together. I've defended my Republican colleagues when Republicans took after them after that veto override. I stand up for people, and I know how to get things done. That's why I would make the best governor.
Question from the audience. More than 70,000 Minnesotans have been adversely affected by cuts to the GAMC program, that's General Assistance Medical Care. The current program favors the metro area for health care access. Would you as governor restore equal access and services statewide? And how would you do this? And we are, Mark Dayton, you get the first shot at this, 2 minutes.
Well, the so-called compromise arrived between Governor Pawlenty and the legislature in the last session proved to be a terrible disaster for especially the hospitals in greater Minnesota, which is why they all said we cannot survive in this arrangement financially. And the result has been, and it will be corrected if I'm governor, I will support the early opt-in to Medicaid and provide that stabilization of funding. But between now and then, as my running mate, terrific senator from greater Minnesota, Yvonne Pretner-Solon, a clinical psychologist, and I can tell this story because it was on the front page of a newspaper recently, but one of her former clients, young man with schizophrenia, lives in Duluth. His mother lives in Albert Lea. She has to leave her work for 2 days, drive from Albert Lea to Duluth, pick him up, drive him to the Twin Cities, the only place where under this failed arrangement he can get the medical care and the prescription medicine he needs to function, and then drive him back to Duluth and then drive herself back to Albert Lea. Now, how cruel and unjust can that be? So I will restore that funding. I will opt into Medicaid for the sake of providing better medical care and to the 102,000 of the poorest of those among us in our state, and also to give us a stable source of funding to hospitals, especially the hospitals in greater Minnesota, who cannot survive financially under the current arrangement. And that means that they will be available to provide better health care for all of us. So that we go into emergency rooms, or our children go into emergency rooms in those crises, they are able to respond. That they're not, and I would point out too that Representative Emmer wants to basically eliminate all public health care funding and turn everybody into a charity case, and turn everybody who can't afford health care to go to some doctor's office and ask for care, which not only is just ridiculously indecent, but also means that anyone else who tries to get care is going to be thwarted.
Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
Well, I think one of the most morally bankrupt things that has ever been done in Minnesota politics and Minnesota public policy was Governor Pawlenty's veto of general assistance medical care, because it was unnecessary. He did it to spite people. And then we worked for an entire year to come up with a better plan, a plan that would have preserved general assistance medical care all across this state. It was a disappointment to me that no Republican would join us in the Minnesota House to override on that bill early in the legislative session. And here's the thing about it. What Governor Pawlenty has wanted to do, and Matt, you're right, he's wanted to do it forever, was gut Minnesota care. The care for working Minnesotans, the care where people pay in their premium every month, the waiters, the servers. He wanted to gut that. And he was trying to do it again, because his plan would have meant we not only lost general assistance medical care, we would have lost Minnesota care. And what we needed to do is be able to get what I fought for at the end of session, and that's the early opt-in to MA. This governor did not want to do that. The next governor has the opportunity, 15 days in the first term, to sign an executive order and bring that $1.4 billion home. $1.4 billion that Congressman Walz voted for, that Senator Klobuchar fought for. And you know what? We need to bring it home. That's the first thing I'll do. We need to be able to get those dollars into the state. It's $6 million for Emmanuel St. Joseph's. Do you know how many jobs that can mean? Direct service, nurses, technicians, doctors, patient care. 20,000 more Minnesotans will have care. All people on general assistance medical care will have care. And 30,000 more jobs by the end of my first term. That's the plan for saving general assistance medical care, is early MA.
Matt Entenza.
I remember what it was like personally to not have health insurance. After my father abandoned us, I remember getting really sick, had bronchitis, and my mom really wrestled with what we were going to do. And I remember lying there in bed, and she leaned over and she said, "Honey, you just got to get better." That's not health care. But that's the sort of health care I think that Tom Emmer and Tim Pawlenty support. And while I pray a lot, I think it's important to recognize that just praying that you get better isn't going to do it. And that's why we need strong public options. That's why, as governor, I will immediately sign an executive order to leverage federal funds so that we can restore the cuts that hurt the over 30,000 people who relied on general assistance medical care. But you need to have someone who understands where they came from, who understands, as I think Tim Pawlenty and Tom Emmer haven't, that we're a big state. We're a big state, and in some parts of our state, it's pretty hard to even get to a doctor. We don't always have hospitals right nearby. And that we need a governor who understands that we have to bring folks together to make sure that everyone can get access to health care. That unless we can ban viruses, which we can't do, of course, that denying access to health care, or people who don't have insurance, means they just wind up at the ER and then we all pay a lot more. It requires leadership as well. In 2005, when Tim Pawlenty wanted to get rid of Minnesota Care, which, as Margaret aptly said, is health care for waiters and waitresses and janitors and security guards, care that they pay for, because he wanted to raid that and use it to pay off a deficit he was creating with his tax breaks for the wealthy. I stood up to him with Dean Johnson, and we prevailed. and we forced him to sign a bill for new revenue. And the next job isn't going to be easy. And as governor, I will lead in that way to make sure that we are able to help the folks who have lost and to make sure that all of Minnesota can come together again.
It's 8:32. We have come to the portion of tonight's debate when we go to the closing statements. Debate Minnesota does have as part of their bylaws that so that the person who has the opening statement doesn't get the last word as well. We go back to the original order, so that means closing statement 2 minutes from Mark Dayton.
Again, thank you, Debate Minnesota. Thank you, all of you who forsook the Vikings training program and came here tonight to be with us. I was born and raised in Minnesota. I've lived and worked here for most of my life. My family's been incredibly fortunate, all we've been given, and with the help of great Minnesotans have been able to build. And I was brought up to believe that to whomsoever much has been given, of him or her shall much be required. And that we should use our good fortune in ways that would benefit other people. That means paying our fair share of taxes. It also means contributing to the betterment of our society and our state, which I've tried to do throughout my life, and I've devoted my life to public service. And I've spent most of the last 35 years working on behalf of the people of Minnesota all over this state. And what I've learned now in this last months of traveling and listening to Minnesotans is that our future is at stake and this state is in crisis. And if we continue going in the wrong direction as we are today, we will be a state that we don't want to leave to our children and grandchildren. We need to invest in a better Minnesota for the future of our state, for the future of Minnesota. And I, more than any other candidate for governor, will raise the revenues necessary to make those investments. Critical investments in public education, in better health care, in job creation, in keeping property taxes down, in providing supportive services to our senior citizens. There's a role for government in making this state better for all the people of this state. It comes from making the richest people in Minnesota pay their share of taxes. I know where the money is. I know where to find it. I know who can afford to pay it. I know they can afford to pay it. And if I'm governor, they will pay it. And I'll invest that money for a better Minnesota. And I ask for your support, your vote on August 10th in the DFL primary. Thank you very much.
A 2-minute closing statement from Margaret Anderson Kelliher.
6 months ago, DFLers gathered in classrooms and cafeterias and libraries across the state to begin the process of picking their next governor. I was honored to receive the DFL endorsement from thousands of Minnesotans, hardworking Minnesotans, who share values that include that our best days are yet to come. DFLers picked me to be their next governor because they know I stand up and fight for them. I will stand up on behalf of them. I never quit. I never back down. I know where I come from, and I know where we need to go. We need to put 204,000 Minnesotans back to work in this state. There's too much at stake in this election to sit it out. We haven't had a DFL governor in 24 years, and what do we have to show for it? We have packed classrooms, skyrocketing property taxes, and the highest unemployment rates in generations. Now is the time for new leadership in the state of Minnesota. Now is the time for a DFL governor. That's why we need a candidate who can beat Tom Emmer in November, and that's why I was selected to do that, moving Minnesota in the right direction. I will be that governor. Minnesota needs a governor who can bring people together time and time again. That's been my track record. A governor who will fight for good jobs and great schools. A governor who will fight for our seniors and our parents. A governor who's going to make sure that every child comes to kindergarten ready to learn. I will do everything it takes to get Minnesotans back to work. I know where I came from, and I will never forget who I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for you, and I'm fighting for Minnesota, because Minnesota's worth fighting for. I don't want to be your U.S. Senator. I don't want to be your president. I want to be your governor. And I want to be a great governor for Minnesota. I ask for your vote on August 10th.
A 2-minute closing statement from Matt Entenza.
When I was a senior in high school at Worthington Senior High, I was trying to figure out if I'd be able to go to college. My family didn't have the money for me to go to college. I'd managed to turn myself around. I'd gone from having horrible grades and a bad attitude with the help of my grandmother and my mom, my sister, I'm sure, would want to take some credit there too, and help from a lot of teachers, to the point where I could actually get into college. But we couldn't figure out how to make it work. And I still remember when we got a call from our local bank president. Now, it's a small town, so everyone knew who the bank president was. The office was kitty corner from the courthouse on Main Street. And John Troth called me up and asked me to come down. Now, in my family, when the bank called, it was not good news. And I asked why he wanted me to come down, and he said, "Don't worry about it, it's good news, I just want you to come." And I still remember sitting there in that big high-back leather chair. I'd never had a chair that high up above my head before. And he pulled a checkbook out, and he said, "We've been talking at the drugstore because your teachers have told us that you're a good young man with a lot of promise. And we've got a scholarship fund, and here's $1,000. Now, that was 30 years ago. That's the money that helped make it so that with loans and work study and work doing farm work over the summer, picking rock, walking beans, working at the Happy Chef as a waiter for minimum wage, I was able to get an opportunity. And now we need a governor who's going to make sure that all of Minnesota has an opportunity. I have stood up to Tim Pawlenty and made Tim Pawlenty blink. The DFL hasn't been able to do that very many times. I helped take the Democrats out of deep in the minority to help get them back into the majority again. And I have a clear plan so that we'll get jobs going and restore education, and yes, we will scrap No Child Left Behind. We're going to do it the Minnesota way, and as your governor, we can make that happen. Thank you very much.
In conclusion tonight, we want to thank Minnesota State University Mankato and the student government for hosting Debate Minnesota tonight. Special thanks to Nathan Gustafson doing yeoman work as the timekeeper tonight. A special thanks to the Bremer and Blandin Foundations for their financial support. Most importantly, thanks to all of you for coming, for listening so well, for watching this through live streaming on your computer or wherever you may be. Also, for those of you who are listening to this on a delayed broadcast either tomorrow or at a later date. Remember, please vote 1 week from Tuesday. That would be August 10th in Minnesota's primary election. Thanks to Jim Ragsdale. I'm just very honored to be sitting next to you up here on the dais. And thanks to all of our candidates. Thank you all for coming. Good night.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Mark. Good. Well done. Well done. Yeah.